She walked into that dark hotel room thinking she was about to get answers from the man she once loved. She put her hand on his chest. She tilted her face up in the dark. And then she stopped. The smell was wrong. The fabric was wrong. Everything was wrong. The light cut through the door, and she saw his face. Not Ryan. And the corner of his mouth lifted, just slightly in the way of a man who already knew this moment was coming, long before she walked through that door. He said quietly, "Wrong brother, darling." In that single moment, Nora Voss did not scream. She did not run. She stood completely still, and she did what her father had spent her entire childhood teaching her to do without her ever knowing she was being taught. She assessed, because Nora was not just a woman who had been lied to. She was the daughter of a man who had spent 20 years mapping the most dangerous secrets in Chicago, and she was the only person alive who could read what he left behind. The man standing in front of her was Callum Reyes, the most informed person in the city, a man who knew everything about everyone, except her. And that was exactly the way her father had planned it. Stay with me. Because this story is not about a woman who needed saving. It is about a woman who was always the key. She just did not know yet what door she was meant to open. This channel exists for one reason. Some people are born to lead. Some are born to understand power at a level that most people never reach. The lessons that matter most in life are never taught in any classroom. Only the people who have stood at the edge of real power, real loyalty, and real consequence ever learn them. This channel does not tell stories about crime. This channel tells stories about mindset, about courage, and about the hidden architecture of genuine power. Welcome. You are exactly where you are supposed to be. Every single chapter of what you are about to hear carries something real inside it. You will learn why the most dangerous thing an intelligent person can do is use information to control the people around them instead of trusting them. You will learn the difference between protecting someone and underestimating them, and why that difference costs more than most people ever expect. You will learn what real loyalty looks like when it is tested not by easy moments, but by the hardest ones. And you will learn something that Edmund Voss spent 20 years trying to say to his daughter, that the world is real, that you should not look away from it, and that the most important decision you will ever make is who you choose to face it with. This is not just a story about a mafia boss and a woman in a dark room. This is a story about what it means to trust someone with the most important thing you have ever built. If this story made you think, if it gave you something you did not have before you pressed play, then do something small that costs you nothing but means everything to this channel. Hit the like button. Leave a comment and tell me which moment hit you hardest. Share this with one person who needs to hear it. And if you are not subscribed yet, do it now, because the next story is already waiting for you. And I promise you, it is worth staying for.
The basement of the Hargrove Institute smelled like old paper and time standing still. At 9:17 in the evening, one fluorescent light hummed above a row of shelves that reached all the way to the ceiling. Every other light in the building had gone dark an hour ago. The cleaning crew had come and gone. The last researcher had packed up at 7. The front desk guard had nodded off in his chair sometime around 8. But Nora Voss was still there. She preferred it this way. She preferred the particular silence that settles into an archive at night. When the last visitor has gone home and the building stops pretending to be anything other than what it is, a place where things are kept, where someone, at some point, decided that this letter, this photograph, this document was worth holding on to. Nora understood that instinct better than most people. She had memorized the exact location of 34 zero documents, and not one of them told her why her father had to die. She worked steadily, the way she always did, moving through the latest donation box without hurrying. A building in Logan Square had been torn down the previous month. The residents had cleared out in stages, leaving behind the things they could not carry: old letters, family photographs, architectural drawings from the 1940s, the ordinary debris of ordinary lives. Nora processed each item with the efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times. She catalogued, labelled, sorted. Her hands moved on their own while her mind ran quietly in the background. 8 months of quietly. 8 months of careful. Her father, Edmund Voss, had died on March 14th. The police called it a robbery. They closed the file in 72 hours. Nora did not need a law degree to understand that 72 hours was too fast for a case with no arrest, no suspect, no explanation for why nothing had actually been taken from his apartment. She knew. She had always known. But knowing without evidence was just another kind of silence. And Nora had learned how to live inside silence a long time ago. 3 days after the funeral, Ryan sent a text message. It said, "I am sorry. This is not something I can be part of." That was all. No phone call. No explanation. The engagement ring arrived by mail 4 days later, wrapped in bubble wrap, packed inside a small cardboard box with no return address. Nora had looked at that box for exactly 12 seconds. Then she put it in the bottom drawer of her nightstand and went to make coffee. She was paying Jake's tuition. Her younger brother, 22 years old, was finishing his final year in Boston, writing his thesis, living in a small apartment near campus, with a girlfriend named Claire and a goldfish named after a philosopher. Jake did not know the inheritance was nearly gone. Jake did not know their father's death was not a robbery. Jake did not know anything at all about any of it, and Nora intended to keep it exactly that way until he graduated in the spring. Careful. That word had kept her functional for 8 months. Careful at work. Careful on the phone. Careful not to ask questions loud enough for the wrong people to hear. Careful not to mention certain things to certain people. Careful to keep her face neutral when she passed the closed police file on her laptop for the 100th time. Careful was exhausting. But it was the only thing keeping Jake in school and keeping herself above ground. She reached the bottom of the donation box. The last sheet of paper was lying face down. She turned it over, and her hands stopped moving. She recognized the line weight before she recognized anything else. That particular way of trailing the pen at the end of a stroke, so the lines tapered instead of ending cleanly. The way the ink pulled ever so slightly in the lower left corner when the person drawing it paused to think. She had watched those hands draw for her entire childhood. She had fallen asleep at her father's desk a dozen times while he worked, breathing in the smell of drafting ink and old maps. This was her father's handwriting. This map should have been burned 8 months ago. She knew it immediately, without any doubt at all. The last time she had spoken to Edmund Voss, the last real conversation. The one that ended with her saying goodnight and him saying he loved her, and neither of them knowing it was the last time he had told her one specific thing. He had said, "If anything ever happens to me, there is a blue box on the top shelf of my closet. I need you to burn everything inside it. Do not look at what is in there. Just burn it." She had never found the blue box. By the time she reached his apartment after the phone call from the police, someone had already been through the place. Not ransacked, too careful for that, but gone through. Systematically, thoroughly, every map he had ever made. Gone. Except this one. Nora did not panic. She did not call anyone. She folded the paper slowly, carefully. Along the original crease lines there were 3 folds, and she matched each one exactly and slid it into the inner pocket of her coat. Then she turned back to the remaining items in the box and continued cataloguing as though nothing had happened. This was the most important thing to understand about Nora Voss. She did not panic. She assessed. And that stillness was not coldness. It was a weapon she had been building without knowing it her entire life. 20 minutes later, her colleague Dennis stopped by the end of the shelf. Dennis said, "Hey, we are ordering pizza upstairs. You want in?" Nora said, "No, thank you." Dennis said, "You sure? You look like you have not eaten since Tuesday." Nora looked up at him. She said, "I ate. I just look like this." Dennis laughed. Nora did not laugh with him, not because she was cold, but because her hand was in her pocket and touching the folded map. And she was already thinking about what it meant and who had placed it in that donation box and whether whoever it was knew that she would be the one to find it. When Dennis walked away, she watched him go for a moment, not because she wanted pizza, because Dennis represented something she had almost forgotten existed. A life where the biggest problem tonight was whether to get pepperoni or mushroom. She finished her work at 10 minutes to 9. She packed up her bag and began her closing round of the building, moving through each room to make sure everything was locked and properly stored before she left. The reading room was on the floor above the basement. She had almost finished checking it when she noticed the man at the corner table. He had been coming for 2 weeks. This was the 3rd time. He always arrived just before closing, sat at the same table in the corner, with his back to the wall and his eyes toward the door, and stayed until she cleared the room. He dressed like a Professor Grey sweater, tortoiseshell glasses, a notebook open in front of him. He was somewhere around 40. He was entirely unremarkable in almost every way, except for 3 things. Phil's security guard, who had worked this building for 15 years and had never once opened a door before a visitor reached it always, without fail, had the reading room door open before this man touched the handle. The other researchers in the room, without ever seeming to make a decision about it, always ended up sitting further away from him within about 3 minutes of his arrival. They never seemed to notice they were doing it, and he never had a phone. No laptop. No device of any kind, just the notebook and a pen. In the current year, a man who came to an archive reading room without a single electronic device was unusual enough that Nora had filed it away the first time she saw it. She went to retrieve the last box from the south shelf. To do it, she had to walk past his table. He did not look up as she approached. He was writing something in the notebook, slowly and deliberately. But as she passed, he said without changing his tone, without lifting his head. Callum said, "Box 7C has been reshelved out of sequence. 3rd shelf from the left, sections covering 1,940 to 1,943 have been placed behind sections covering 1,951 to 1,955, in case it matters to you." Nora stopped. She looked toward the shelf he had named. He was right. Completely right. Down to the exact years. The deviation was subtle enough that she had missed it herself during her last check, and she never missed things in this archive. Nobody would notice that unless they had already memorized the organization of these shelves, and memorized them precisely enough to recognize when something was off. She said, "How do you know that?" He looked up for the first time. His eyes were not cold. They were not warm. They were calculating the way someone's eyes look when they are reading a map, rather than looking at a person, taking in information, sorting it, deciding what it meant. He said, "I notice things that are out of place. It is a habit." Nora said nothing more. She retrieved the box and went back to her desk. She sat down. She did not open the box. She sat still for 30 seconds and thought about a man who notices things out of place, who comes to an archive reading room 3 times without requesting a single document, and who has somehow committed the entire shelving system to memory before anyone even knew he was paying attention. The map in her coat pocket felt twice as heavy as it had a moment ago. At 9 minutes to 9, she went back to the reading room to close it. He was still at the corner table. His notebook was closed now, and he was looking at the door before she stepped through it. Nora said, "We close at 9, he said. "It is 8:52, he said. "You have been here for 4 hours and you have not requested a single document." He stood up. He put on his coat slowly, each movement deliberate. Nothing hurried. Like a person who has already decided exactly what comes next and sees no reason to rush toward it, he said, "Sometimes you come to a place just to remember what it used to hold." She looked at him steadily. What she felt was not romantic curiosity. It was professional curiosity, the kind she felt when a document turned up in the wrong collection, and she needed to understand why. She said, "You knew Edmund Voss." Not a question. He neither confirmed nor denied it. He moved toward the door. Phil already had it open. But before he stepped through, without turning around, he said, "Your father was a very careful man, Miss Voss. That is a quality worth inheriting." Then he was gone. Nora stood in the empty reading room and listened to the fluorescent light hum. She had 34 documents memorized. She had no record of this man anywhere in her system, not a signature in any request log, not a name in any registration form, not a single trace. That was not carelessness. That was skill. She put her hand in her coat pocket and touched the folded map. She stood there for a long time. Nora did not sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen table from 11 in the evening until almost 6 in the morning, with her father's map spread out in front of her under the overhead light. She had made coffee twice and let both cups go cold. The map was not a geographic map. She had understood that the moment she opened it, because her father had taught her to read this language when she was 9 years old, through what he called the secret coordinates game, bedtime stories with hidden meanings, where rivers stood for money trails and mountain peaks stood for power, where the distance between 2 points measured not miles but trust. He had said it was just a game, just something special between them. She had believed him for 19 years. Now she understood he had been teaching her a code, the only code that would ever open what he had built. And he had put it inside her when she was small enough to learn it, without knowing she was learning anything at all. She read the maps slowly, carefully, tracing each symbol the way he had shown her, and 3 names emerged from the coded lines. 2 of them she recognized. The third one made her stop. Senator Harlan Mast, the man currently running for governor of Illinois. The man whose face was on every billboard on the expressway and whose campaign offices had opened in 4 cities in the past 6 months. His name was at the center of her father's map, connected to 11 other names by lines that, in Edmund's private language, meant something she did not want to think about too clearly at 4 in the morning. Her phone rang at 5:47. Unknown number. She let it ring. It rang again, then a third time. She answered. The voice was the man from the reading room, calm, unhurried, as though calling someone before sunrise was a perfectly ordinary thing. He said, "I need to see that map, Miss Voss." Not to take it. To explain what it means, she said. "How do you have this number?" He said. "The same way I know you found it last night. The same way I know you have not slept." 8 seconds of silence. Nora looked at the kitchen window. The curtains were drawn. He said, "Where?" That afternoon, just as she was getting ready to leave her apartment and meet him. Her phone buzzed with a text message. She looked at the screen. Ryan's number. She had not seen Ryan's name on her phone in 8 months. The last message had been the one that said, "I am sorry." She had read that message 40 or 50 times in the first 2 weeks after receiving it, trying to find something in those 10 words that would explain what had happened to the 14 months before them. This new message said, "Nora, I know I do not have the right to reach out, but I need to see you tonight. There is something I have to explain. She read it twice. Then she wrote back. Where? What time? Ryan's response came within 30 seconds. Reverie Hotel. Room 814. 9 p.m. Do not tell anyone where you are going. That last sentence. She read it 3 times. Do not tell anyone. In 8 months of learning to read the things people did not say, she had become very good at hearing fear in the words people chose. And that sentence, not "please keep this private," not "this is between us," But do not tell anyone that was the sentence of someone who was being watched and knew it. She went to meet the stranger first. At the breakfast diner in Pilsen he had named. She listened to what he had to say. She did not tell him about Ryan's message. Then she went to the Reverie Hotel. The 8th floor hallway was quiet. The lighting was gold and dim. The kind of old hotels still use because they think it looks expensive. Room 814 was at the far end. Past the ice machine that hummed steadily in an alcove. Nora stood outside the door at 8:58. She knocked once. No answer. She tried the handle. It was unlocked. The room was dark inside. Only the ambient orange glow of streetlights coming through the thin curtains. Just enough to make out the shape of a man standing near the window. His back was to her. His shoulders were the right width. His height was right. The way his weight shifted when he heard the door, that particular stillness before turning, was exactly the way she remembered. She said, "Ryan." The figure turned, stepped toward her in the dark. And the part of her that had spent 14 months memorizing a person, his voice, his footsteps, the specific way he moved through a room, responded before her conscious mind could say anything at all. She stepped forward. She put her hand against his chest. She tilted her face up in the dark, looking for familiar lines. And then she stopped. The smell was wrong. Not Ryan's. This was something older, heavier, cold air and something like worn leather. The fabric under her hand was not the smooth cotton of Ryan's dress shirts. This was wool, dense, heavyweight wool. Her hand went still. Light cut through the gap under the door as someone in the hallway triggered the motion sensor. Just for a moment. Just barely enough. She saw his face. Not Ryan, the man from the archive. The man from the reading room. 40 years old. Grey sweater. Those calculating eyes. And one corner of his mouth had lifted in the particular way of someone whose prediction has been confirmed. He said, "Wrong, brother. Darling." Nora stepped back. 2 full steps. She did not scream. Screaming was not at the top of the list of useful things to do right now. Her brain was running 6 things simultaneously and it needed all the bandwidth. She said, "You are," he said. "Callum Reyes. Ryan's older brother. And I am probably the only person in this building tonight who does not intend to hurt you," she said. "Probably," he said. "Certainly. Probably is how I speak to people I do not yet have complete information on," she said. "Ryan texted me to come here," he said. "No. Someone texted you from Ryan's phone. Ryan does not know you are here. Ryan does not know where he is tonight either," she said. "You are saying he said. Someone used Ryan's phone to bring you to a dark hotel room where nobody knows your location. That is what I am saying." Silence. Nora looked at the window, the door. Back at him. She was already working out the exits. Before she consciously decided to do it, she said, "Who knew I would come?" He said, "Whoever sent that text. And whoever they work for the same person I came here to make sure did not find you first." He stepped to the side, deliberately, creating a clear path between her and the door. He said, "You can leave right now. I will not stop you. But they will find another way to reach you, and next time I may not be here first." Nora stood still for 10 seconds. She was doing what she always did in moments like this, which was count what she knew against what she did not know, and try to determine which list was longer. Known. This man knew her father's name. He had known about the map before she told anyone about it. He had come to this hotel room specifically to be here, before whoever had lured her arrived. Unknown, everything else. He said, "My father's map. You know what it is." "I know it is part of something much larger than what you are holding tonight," she said. "Then explain it to me." He said, "Not here." "A beat," she said. "Where then?" They left through the service exit. Callum went first, not to lead her. She noticed, but to check. He held the stairwell door for exactly 3 seconds before stepping through it himself, scanning the landing below before he moved. She noticed the difference between leading and checking, and she filed it away. On the sidewalk, the November air hit her face hard. Chicago in winter does not ease you into the cold. It just arrives, she said, not looking at him. 8 months ago, Ryan left me 3 days after my father died. He sent me a text that said he was sorry, and then he mailed back the ring. Did you know anything about that? Callum was quiet for a moment. She would learn later that this was how he operated, that he distinguished between questions that needed an immediate answer and questions that deserved a careful one. He said, "Not entirely, but I had suspicions. And my suspicions about Ryan have tended to be more accurate than I would prefer." He said, "He is your brother." He said, "Yes." He said, "That does not," he said. "That is exactly why I am standing here instead of sending someone else to handle tonight. Because Ryan is my brother. And what he does or does not do is my responsibility in some way. Even though I have spent years trying not to think about it like that." Nora stopped walking. She turned and looked at him in the streetlight. He was looking back at her with those same measuring eyes. "Not unkind, not warm, just honest," she said. "You were in that reading room 3 times. You were watching me," he said. "I was trying to understand the situation before I introduced myself. You deserve that. You had been through enough without a stranger walking up to your desk." She thought about that. Then she said, "Tomorrow, you have 1 hour to explain everything. After that I decide," he said. "Agreed." She started walking toward the subway. Behind her, she heard him say, quietly, "He would have been proud of the way you handled tonight, Miss Voss, for what it is worth." She did not turn around, but she heard it, and it settled into her chest in a way she was not prepared for, in that raw place that had not stopped aching since March. She walked home alone through the cold streets of Chicago, with her father's map in her pocket and the shape of the wrong man's face still printed somewhere behind her eyes. Not Ryan at all. Wrong brother, darling. 3 words. And somehow everything after tonight was going to be different because of them. The diner in Pilsen was exactly the kind of place Nora liked without knowing it, small enough that nobody came in just to be seen. Old enough that the booths had settled into the particular softness of furniture that has held 1,000 people through 1,000 conversations. The coffee was strong. The menu had not changed in 20 years. Caslam arrived first. She had not told him she would be early, but he was already there when she walked in at 6:53, sitting at the corner table with his back to the wall and his eyes on the door. He had already ordered her coffee. Double espresso. No sugar, no cream. She sat down and looked at the cup. She said, "How do you know how I take my coffee?" He said, "You come here on Wednesday mornings before your shift. You have been coming here for about a year. The order does not change." He said, "You have been watching me." He said, "I map places that matter to people who matter to what I do. It is habit, not preference." He said, "When did I start mattering to what you do?" He picked up his own coffee. Did not answer right away. Then he said, "When your father sent me a message 3 weeks before he died, it said, if something happens to me, something will find its way to you. It will come through my daughter. She is the only person who can read it." Nora was very still. He said, "Your father worked for me for 15 years, Miss Voss. Nothing official, nothing on paper, nothing that could be traced." She said, "Worked for you doing what?" He said, "He was a cartographer. In every sense, not just of physical space of power, of the connections between people and money and influence that make a city run the way it actually runs, as opposed to the way people pretend it runs. Every quarter for 15 years. He sent me updated maps, each one built on the last. By the end, he had documented something that took me years to fully understand the scope of." She said, "He never told me any of this." He said, "He was protecting you from knowing what he knew. He believed those 2 things were incompatible, knowing and being safe. So he chose your safety. Every time. For 15 years. He chose your safety." Nora looked at her coffee cup. Something in her chest was doing something complicated, and she did not have time for it right now, she said. "And the map I found," he said, "is the last one he sent, but not through our usual channel. He arranged for it to be placed in a donationed box that would eventually reach your archive. On your shift. At the right time," she said. "He planned it before he died," he said. "He knew something was coming for him. He did not know when. So he built a way for this to survive without him," he said, "and the map leads to," he said, "evidence, 20 years of it. Your father did not just document relationships and connections. He documented transactions, meetings, money, names, all of it. Nothing to bring down not one or two people, but an entire structure of power. He split it into 7 separate pieces and hid them in 7 different locations. The map is the key. But the map is encoded in a private language, she said, that only I can read. He said, yes. She put her cup down. She looked at him directly for the first time since she had sat down. She said, 2 conditions. He waited. He said, 1. My brother Jake knows nothing. Not now, possibly not ever. Anything involving him goes through me first and only me. He said, agreed. 2. You do not make decisions about what I can handle. You do not manage what information I receive or when I receive it. You tell me everything relevant, immediately, and I decide what to do with it. A pause, he said. That will sometimes slow things down. She said, I am not looking for fast. I am looking for honest. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, agreed, she said. And 1 question. Not a condition. A question, he said. Ask it, he said. Why did my father trust you? He did not answer immediately. She was beginning to understand. How processed questions about himself, more slowly than questions about anything else, he said. Because he had been watching me long enough to see that I map people to protect them, not to use them. He told me that the day we started working together. Whether that is still entirely true, after 15 years I am not certain. But it is what he believed. She nodded. Stood up, she said. 2 days to decode the map. After that, we talk about what I found. She was almost at the door when she stopped. Not turning around, she said. The man in the dark jacket across the street. He has been there since before I arrived. Is he yours? Callum did not look toward the window. His eyes shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, in the way of someone running a mental calculation. No, she said. Then we are being followed, he said. You were being followed before you sat down. I did not want to distract you before you had heard what I needed to say. She turned then and looked at him. Not with anger exactly. With something sharper than anger and more durable, he said, next time. Tell me immediately, he said. Agreed. She walked out into the grey November morning. She did not look at the man across the street. She had already noted everything about him that mattered: height, weight, the angle of his shoulders, the way he held his phone without looking at it. Her father had taught her that too, so quietly she had not known she was being taught. The most important information is what the other person thinks you do not have. She had learned that from Edmund Voss before she was old enough to understand what it meant. Now she understood exactly what it meant. She turned the corner and walked toward the subway without looking back. And she thought, whatever Callum Reyes is, whatever he has done in 15 years of working in the dark, Edmund Voss watched him do it. And Edmund Voss, who had been the most careful man she had ever known in her entire life, had decided he was worth trusting. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, quite a lot. The office on the 14th floor had no name on the door and no logo on the frosted glass. From the outside, there was nothing to indicate that the company listed on the building directory, a financial consulting firm called Meridian Research Group, was anything other than what it claimed to be. The name was generic in the way that real businesses sometimes are, and fake ones always are. Inside was different. Nora walked in the next morning with the decoded first section of the map and stopped just past the doorway to take it in. She had expected something that looked like power. Instead, she found something that looked like work. Good light for reading, not for impressing. A large table covered in organized papers, filing cabinets along one wall. Each drawer labeled in a system she recognizes immediately because it was a real archive system, not a decorative one. And on the walls maps, Chicago through the decades, 1,000, 871 after the fire, 1,000, 920 in the jazz years, 1,000, 968 the year the city tore itself apart, 2010 when the skyline had settled into its current shape. Historical, careful, informative, and between them, at intervals. Sheets of paper in a line weight she would have known anywhere. Her father's work. She moved closer without deciding to. Her hand reached out and touched one of the sheets. The way she touched old documents at the archive slowly, checking the weight of it before committing. She said, "He made these." Callum said, from behind her. 12 years of them. Updated every quarter. He never missed one. Not even when he was in the hospital for a knee surgery in 2019. That update arrived by courier from his room, he said. He never showed me any of these. Callum said, "He was protecting you from knowing what he knew." She said, "You keep saying that," he said. "Because it is the most important thing to understand about everything your father did for the last 20 years. She turned and looked at him. Callum Reyes in daylight was slightly different from Callum Reyes in the dim reading room. There were lines around his eyes that she had not noticed before, the kind that come from years of paying close attention to things in low light. She thought, "He has been doing this for a very long time," he said. "Let us get to work." They sat across from each other at the large table. Nora spread out the sections she had decoded from the map's first layer. She explained the system quickly. Without over-explaining, she could tell within 30 seconds of talking to someone whether they needed more words or fewer. And Callum needed fewer. He understood the logic almost immediately, filling in context where she had blanks and letting her fill in his. It was unusual. Working with someone whose mind moved at the same pace as hers in the same direction. She was decoding a section that referenced an unnamed location when she needed him to cross-reference something from his records. He stood up, walked to the third filing cabinet from the left, opened the drawer, counted 6 folders in, and pulled out the one she needed. No searching, no hesitation, as if he had done it 1,000 times. She said, "You organize using my father's system," he said. "He redesigned my entire archive in 2012, spent 2 weeks on it. Said mine was functional, but not intuitive." Those were his exact words. She felt something shift. Not quite trust. Recognition. The particular recognition of finding something in an unfamiliar place that you have only ever seen in one specific context. He had worked alongside her father long enough that their systems had merged. Their language had merged, she said. "He taught me the same things he taught you." Callum said, "Different things, I think. He taught me how to organize information. He taught you how to read it." She considered that, then said, "Both matter," he said. "Yes." They worked through the morning. At some point, coffee appeared on the table. Callum had evidently signalled someone, though she had not seen him do it. At some point, sandwiches appeared. She ate without stopping her work, which she suspected he noticed. By early afternoon, the picture coming out of the first sections of the map was significantly larger than she had expected. Her father had not only documented relationships and power structures, he had documented evidence, hard, specific, datable evidence transactions and meetings and money movements, carefully noted in the geographic code only Nora could fully translate. 20 years of it, she said. He built a library. Callum said quietly, "He built a bomb." She looked up. He said, "What is in those 7 locations is not just information. It is usable evidence. The kind that, in the right hands, at the right time, does not just inconvenience powerful people. It ends them. And it ends the structures that keep them in place," she said. "And he left me the instructions for finding it," he said. "He left you the key. He left me the context. And he left us the map." Us, she noticed the word. She said, "Did you know the scope of what he was building?" Callum was quiet, long enough that she looked up from the papers. He said, "I knew he was documenting. I did not know how much, or how deep it went. If I had known," he stopped. "You would have stopped him," he said. "I would have been more careful with him." That sentence was not a strategic statement. She heard the weight in it. The specific weight of someone saying out loud, for what might be the first time, a thing they have been carrying privately for a long time. She looked back at the map sections on the table, then said, "One of the 7 locations is in Boston." He said, "Yes." She said, "Jake is in Boston." He said, "Yes." She said. He does not know. He said. No. But whoever is looking for what your father hid will eventually work out the geography. It is only a matter of time before they connect the location to the name, he said. I will deal with Jake separately, he said. I know. She said. I need 2 more days for the remaining sections, he said. Take whatever time you need. She stood and gathered her coat. At the door she stopped, and she said without turning, Your archive is better organized than mine. My father always said I was too conservative with cross-referencing. She left before he could respond. In the elevator going down, she realized she was breathing a little differently than she had been an hour ago. Not faster, just different. Like a person who has been walking uphill without realizing it and suddenly finds the ground is level again. Her father had spent 15 years in that room, working with that man, trusting him, building something together that neither of them had told her about. She had 2 more days of decoding ahead of her and 7 pieces of evidence to find and a senator's name in the center of a map that someone had gone to a great deal of trouble to make sure she found. She thought about Edmund Voss sitting at that same table, drinking coffee from that same good light, sending updates every quarter for 15 years without missing a single one. He had not been hiding from her. He had been building something for her. That was a distinction that mattered more than she had words for right now. The second morning, Nora brought food. She did not announce it. She stopped at her usual place on the way, ordered the same things she always did for herself, added a second order, and arrived at the 14th floor at 9 a.m. with 2 sandwiches and 2 coffees in a brown paper bag. She set one of each in front of Callum without explanation. He looked at the sandwich, looked at her, looked back at the map sections on the table. He said, You did not have to, she said. I know. Eat. You have been here since before I arrived, and Phil does not bring sandwiches. He ate. He did not say thank you with words, but the way he ate unhurried, attentive, as if the sandwich deserved to be eaten properly, was the kind of gratitude her father had also expressed without language. She recognized it. They worked. For several hours. Without much talking that was not directly related to the map. She decoded. He provided context. She named a location. He had already pulled the corresponding file. He described a connection. She had already found the symbol. They had developed, without discussing it, a shared shorthand. The particular efficiency of 2 people who process information the same way, working in the same direction. She noticed things about him in those hours that she could not have noticed in a meeting or a confrontation. He had a notebook that he wrote in constantly, but she saw that what he was writing was not notes, it was questions. Each one written out in full, and then crossed off when it was answered. Most of the questions in the current notebook were still uncrossed. He was a person who lived with a lot of unanswered questions. More than he let on. At 11:30, Jake called, he answered, kept her voice entirely normal. Jake wanted to come to Chicago at the end of the month. He wanted to have dinner at the Italian place on Taylor Street that their father had loved. He wanted to see her face and check that she was okay, though he said it in the indirect way he always had, dressing the concern as a practical matter. She said yes. She set the date. She said she could not wait. She meant it. When she hung up, she sat still for a moment. Callum said, without looking up, He does not know. Not a question, she said. He is finishing a thesis. He has his whole life in front of him, and none of it needs to include this. Callum said, He will find out eventually, she said. Eventually is not now. He looked up at her then, not in the way he looked at the map, not collecting and sorting, looking in the way of someone who has just recognized something. He said, Your father did the same thing for 20 years. Protected everyone from knowing by carrying it alone. By the time the danger reached him, there was nobody standing next to him, she said. Is that a warning? He said. An observation. The Voss family has a pattern. She looked at him. She knew he was right. Knowing he was right did not make it easier to sit with. She turned back to the map. There was a name in the section she was working on that did not fit the pattern of the others. Not Mast, not Webb. A first name only Daniel, she said. Who is Daniel? The silence that followed was different from the usual working silences. This one had weight in it. He said, "My youngest brother." She waited. He said, "Daniel worked in finance." He was intelligent, careful, very good at making things disappear and reappear in plain sight in ways that most people could not follow. He found something material about people I had been watching for years. Instead of bringing it to me, he started building a case on his own. He thought that if he told me, I would stop him. He paused. Then he said, "They found his car by the river on a Friday morning. They never found Daniel." Nora said, "How long ago?" He said, 7 years. He said, "And Ryan left the family 2 months after that." He said, "Yes." She said, "You thought he left because of what this world is?" "Because of you," he said. "I thought he was the smart one for going, that I had made my family dangerous, and he had seen that and walked away. That was what I believed for a long time." He said it evenly. "But there was something underneath the evenness," she said. "But he did not leave to be safe," he said. "He left to be comfortable. Those are not the same thing." She looked at the name Daniel on the map. Then she said, quietly, "My father mapped what happened to your brother. It is in this section." Callum did not move. She could see his hands. Flat on the table, perfectly still, he said, "Show me." She did something then that she made a conscious choice about. She did not stand across the table and explain the symbols. She stood up and walked around to his side and placed the map section between them and read it aloud, every symbol, every connection, every date, not because he could not have understood it from across the table, but because this was news about a missing brother, and nobody should hear something like that alone. When she finished, neither of them spoke. They stood there next to each other for about 30 seconds, looking at the map. The fluorescent light above the table hummed somewhere outside. The wind had picked up and was pressing against the tall windows. Then Callum said, very quietly, "He left a map for everyone he lost. Your father was very thorough." And Nora said, without thinking about it first, "He loved people by documenting them. It was the only language he had." Another silence. A different kind. Then Callum said, "I have food coming at 7. If you are still here," she said, "I will still be here." She went back to her side of the table. He went back to his. They kept working. At 7, a restaurant delivery arrived, real dinner, not sandwiches. The kind of food that takes a while to eat properly. They ate at the table, and for the first time since the map had come out of that donation box, they talked about something that was not the map. She asked him how he had learned to read historical cartography. He told her about a library in Pilsen. Whence he was maybe 10 or 11, an old man who volunteered there on Saturday mornings, who believed that maps were the most honest documents human beings ever made. Because a map cannot pretend to be something it is not, she said. My father said something similar, he said. He quoted that same idea often. The first time he said it to me, I thought it was coincidence. The second time I asked him where he had heard it, he said. What did he say? He said he had worked it out on his own, over a long career. But the way he said it, I think he had heard it somewhere too, and simply made it his own, which is probably the most honest thing you can do with an idea worth keeping. She thought about Edmund Voss sitting at this same table, saying those words to Callum. 15 years of quarterly meetings, updating maps together, carrying something enormous in the quiet space between professional and personal. She said, he never talked about you, not once, in all the time I was growing up. Callum said, he was protecting you, she said. I know. I am still getting used to the shape of it. The shape of a person who was also a person I did not know existed. He existed. The parts you knew and the parts you did not were the same person. He never stopped being your father, not for a single day in 15 years of this work. That is something I can tell you with certainty. She looked at him across the table. The overhead light cast shadows he did not seem to notice. She said, Thank you for that. He said, It is true. She said, I know. That is why I said thank you. He looked at her for a moment, not calculating. Something else. She looked away first and finished the dinner. On the third morning, Nora arrived at the Hargrove Institute at 8 a.m. and knew immediately that something was wrong. Nothing was obviously wrong. That was precisely the point. The room looked exactly as she had left it. The lights came on when they should. The temperature in the document storage area was correct. Phil was at his desk. Everything was in its proper place, except for three things that were not. A box on the third shelf had been opened and resealed, she could tell, because the dust line on the lid did not match the base. A folder in the 1940s Chicago section had been moved approximately 3 centimeters to the left, and the chair at the reading table, nearest the east window, was at a slightly different angle than she kept it. Nothing taken, nothing obviously disturbed. Someone had come in, looked for something, and left with extraordinary care. The care was the tell. A casual trespasser leaves chaos. Whoever this was had known exactly what they were doing and had done it well enough that nobody except the person who had memorized this room would have noticed. She called Callum. He arrived 22 minutes later. She watched him move through the archive in her space for the first time, and what she noticed was that he treated it the way he treated his own office, nothing touched that did not need to be. Every observation registered and noted before any conclusion was drawn. When he was done, he came back to her desk and reported as if she were the one who would be deciding what to do next. He said, "The rear loading dock camera has a blind spot. 14 seconds. Every hour exactly on the hour. Someone who knew that used it at 2:s even a.m., he said. You mapped this building, he said. I map places where people who matter to me spend their time. When did I become someone who matters to you? He looked at her steadily. He said, when your father decided you did, and I had no reason to disagree. She processed that for a moment, then said, we need to know who sent someone here. He said, I have a contact, someone who tracks movement across the networks I operate in. If there is a connect between whoever entered this building last night and whoever has been applying pressure from the political side, she will know. Can you come with me? He said. Yes. They went to a restaurant in the River North neighborhood, a Polish place that had been in the same location for 40 years, which meant it had outlasted several changes in who controlled that part of the city and had learned not to ask questions about the people who ate there. Donna Rivers was already at the table when they arrived. She was around 50, with grey starting in her dark hair, and the kind of stillness that comes from having been the most observant person in every room for decades. She ran a chain of laundromats across the north side that had, as far as anyone could document, operated cleanly and legally for her entire ownership. She also maintained, in her very precise memory, a complete record of every significant piece of information that had moved through the neighborhoods she operated in for the past 30 years. She looked at Nora when they sat down. She said, Edmund's daughter. Nora said, you knew him. Donna said, anyone worth knowing in this city knew your father. He was very good at being invisible to people who did not look carefully, and very visible to the ones who did. She picked up her coffee. Then she said, looking at Callum, the person who went into her archive last night is not operating independently. They work for someone who has been very quiet for a very long time. And I want you to hear this clearly. They are not looking for the archive. They are looking for her. She nodded at Nora. Nora said, because of the map. Donna said, because of what the map leads to. And because of what you are the person who can read it. You are the key, not the document. You understand that distinction. Nora said, yes. Donna said, then you understand that you need to be considerably more careful than you have been. Nora said, I have been very careful for 8 months. Donna said, you were careful about the wrong things. You were careful not to be noticed. Now you need to be careful not to be found. On the walk back, Callum said, there is something I have not told you yet. He said, tell me. He said, your father did not leave that map in the donation box by accident. He arranged it. He found a specific organization that was donating a specific collection from a specific building, and he arranged for one item to be added to that collection, to reach your archive, on your shift, after his death. She stopped walking, she said. He planned this before he died. Callum said. He knew something was closing in on him. He did not know exactly when. So he built a path away for what he had spent 20 years building to survive him, he said. And the path goes through me. He said, you were always the path, I think. From the moment he started teaching you the coordinate system at age 9, he was not playing a game with you. Nora, he was teaching you the key. She stood on the sidewalk. November wind. November grey light. The kind of afternoon that makes Chicago feel very large and very old, she said. He could have burned everything, started over, walked away. Callum said, yes, she said. He chose not to. He said, he chose you. She started walking again. She needed to move. When she walked, she could think more clearly. That evening, they worked later than they had before. The last section of the map was in front of them, and the picture was almost fully assembled now. She was working through a particularly complex encoded section when Callum's phone lit up. He looked at it, and something shifted in his posture. He made 3 calls in rapid succession, short, specific, efficient. She watched him move through a crisis she could not fully hear, speaking to people in the deliberate shorthand of someone who has done this 1,000 times. When he was done, he stood at the window. She came to stand next to him. She said, is everyone all right? Yes. A situation was developing on the south side. It has been redirected. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I have been doing this alone for 11 years. Working alone is more efficient in certain ways. You can move faster. The calculations are cleaner, she said. But he looked at her. He said, tonight I looked up while I was on those calls and you were in the room. And something about having you here made the decisions clearer. Not easier, clearer. She thought about that. About what it would mean for a person like Callum Reyes to say something like that. He said, my father left something in those maps that I did not find until this afternoon. Something directed specifically to me. Not encoded in the geographic system, written in a margin note in plain English in the bottom right corner of the 3rd section. He said, what did it say? He said, this is the world. Nora, do not look away from it, and do not face it alone. Callum was very still. She said, I think he was talking about more than the evidence. I think he was talking about the part that comes after. Outside, Chicago spread itself out in its winter geometry. Streets of lights in a grid that her father had mapped in dozens of different ways across 20 years. The same city, documented again and again. Because he believed that the right documentation in the right hands at the right time could matter. She thought about her father at his own windows somewhere, looking at the same city, deciding to trust Callum Reyes with the most important work of his life. She thought, Edmund Voss was the most careful man I ever knew, and he was not careless about people. She turned and looked at Callum. She said, I need to keep working. The last section is almost done. He said, I know. I will get more coffee. He moved away from the window. She went back to the table. The map waited. Marcus Webb called her at 7 in the morning. She almost did not answer. Unknown numbers had become something she was wary of, but something about the timing before she would have left for the institute, as if whoever it was knew her schedule made her pick up. The voice said, my name is Marcus Webb. I was a colleague of your father's for 22 years. I think you know why I am calling, she said. Tell me what you want. Mr. Webb, he said, I want to meet you today. Without Callum Reyes present. There is something you need to hear before you go any further. She met him at a park 3 blocks from the institute. He was older than the photograph she had found in her father's papers, more worn down, as if the years since that photograph had been particularly heavy ones. But his eyes were sharp and quiet. He said, I am going to tell you something that is going to be difficult to hear, and I want to tell you that I debated telling you for a long time, but I think you deserve to know before you commit to this. Then say it, he said. Callum Reyes received a specific threat report about your father, not a general warning about elevated risk in the network. A specific report. Your father's name. A timeline. The method. 1 week before Edmund died. Nora said nothing. Webb said, he did not warn your father. She sat with that for a moment. He said. How do you know this? He said. Because the person who delivered that report to Callum is someone I have known for years. He told me about it 3 months ago. He has been carrying it for 8 months, he said. And you are telling me now because Webb said, because I watched what happened to your father and I have been trying to decide what my responsibility is ever since. I am telling you now because you are about to walk into something very deep, and you should not walk into it without knowing what you are walking toward, he said. Thank you, Mr. Webb. She stood up and left the park. She took the subway to the West Loop and rode the elevator to the 14th floor and walked into Callum's office without stopping at the outer door. He was at his table. He looked up when she came in, and something in his face changed, not guilt. Not exactly, but a settling. Like a person bracing for something they have been waiting for, he said. Did you receive a specific threat report about my father? 1 week before he died. He did not answer immediately. That pause, that brief, real pause. It was the first answer. She said, Tell me, he said. I received an elevated threat warning covering several people in my network. I assessed the risk level and increased security for 3 individuals I identified as highest priority. Your father was not on that list because the intelligence I had indicated that the primary target of the escalating threat was me. Not him, she said. But he died. Not you, he said. Yes, she said. And you have known this for 8 months, he said. Yes. The room was very quiet, she said. You let me sit in this room for a week, reading his maps, telling you about what his life meant, telling you about Daniel and Ryan and things I have not said to anyone else. While the entire time you knew you might have been able to warn him, he said. I did not know, she said. You knew enough to wonder, and you made a choice not to tell me. He did not deny it. He did not reach for a defense. He looked at her and he said the honest thing. He said, I was afraid that if you knew, you would stop working on the map. And I needed you to finish it. Silence. It was not a beautiful confession. It was an honest one. And honest confessions that are also genuinely bad are harder to deal with than ones that are simply mean, because you cannot dismiss them, he said, finally. At least that is true, he said. Nora, right then, his phone lit up and one of the men who worked for him came through the door. The man spoke quietly and quickly. Senator Mast had made a move on Jake's location in Boston. Not a direct approach, a less visible one. But the intention was clear. Callum had his phone out before the sentence was finished. He made 2 calls in under 90 seconds. He had 3 people redirected to Jake's location. By the time he confirmed the all clear, 4 minutes had passed from first notification. Jake was safe. Nora stood with her coat in her hands and watched him do it. He moved fast and right and without hesitation. He protected her brother, the brother of the person whose father he had not protected. She put on her coat, said, Nora, he said, Jake is safe. That is what matters right now, he said. I should have told you, she said, yes. She stopped at the door. Did not turn around, she said. The map is decoded. You have everything you need to finish what my father started. You do not need me anymore. He started to say something. She was already through the door. The elevator was mercifully fast. On the street. She walked for 20 minutes in a direction she had not particularly decided on. The cold was sharp and real, and she let it be. She thought about her father deciding to trust a man, and that trust having a cost she had not known about, and Edmund choosing to trust him anyway. Through 15 years of every quarter without exception. Right up until the end. She thought, there are things you know about a person, and still choose to work with them. Edmund Voss had known things about Callum Reyes and had still chosen him, he thought. But that was Edmund's choice to make. This is mine. She walked home. She needed time. She needed space to think about what her father had known and what he had decided anyway. She needed to figure out whether she was walking away from Callum Reyes permanently or just walking far enough to think clearly. She did not know yet. She walked for a long time. The city moved around her and did not notice her, which was, in this particular moment, exactly what she needed. 3 days. She gave herself 3 days. She did not go to the 14th floor. She did not answer his messages, of which there were exactly two, both brief. Both leaving the decision to her. She noticed that he did not push. She noted it as information. She worked from her apartment. She had decoded the full map, and she used what she had learned to trace the geography of the 7 evidence locations, understanding where each piece of what her father had built was sitting and what it was waiting for. And in doing that work alone, she read her father's maps differently than she had in Callum's presence. She saw things she had not been looking for before. Edmund Voss had documented Callum Reyes the same way he had documented everyone else in his maps. The same precise, unsentimental record-keeping. The same geographic code applied to power and relationships and money. He had documented Callum's early years building the information network, documented the years when it grew, and the costs of that growth. Documented the years when the line between protecting people and being someone people needed protection from had blurred. He had seen all of it, and he had kept working with him, quarter after quarter, for 15 years, without stopping. He had also documented the threat report that Callum had received 1 week before March 14th. It was there in the map. In her father's careful notation, she had decoded it without realizing what it was. The first time. Now she read it clearly. Edmund had known. He had found out she did not know exactly how. But the notation was dated 3 days after the report was delivered to Callum. Edmund Voss had found out within 3 days that the man he trusted most had made the decision not to warn him. And he had kept working. He had sent his last quarterly update. He had arranged the donation box. He had written the margin note, "This is the world. Nora, do not look away from it. And do not face it alone." She sat with that for a long time. Her father had known. And he had still chosen Callum, not blindly, not without knowing the whole picture. With the full picture in front of him, Edmund Voss had decided that Callum Reyes was still the right choice. That was not the same thing as forgiving him. It was something more complicated than forgiveness. It was the decision of a man who understood imperfect people and imperfect choices and still believed that the direction a person was moving mattered more than the mistakes they had made. Jake called on the second day. He had heard from Claire that something felt off and he was checking in. She told him the truth. Not all of it, but the shape of it, she said. Dad did important work for a long time. He believed it needed to be done. He protected us from knowing about it because he was trying to protect us, and that was both the most loving thing he knew how to do and also a mistake. I understand both things at the same time. Jake was quiet. Then he said, "Are you finishing it?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Does the person helping you know what he is doing?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Did Dad trust him?" She said, "Yes." Jake said, "Then finish it. Nora, that is what he was saying when he left it to you." After she hung up, she sat at the kitchen table in the afternoon light and thought about the shape of what her father had handed her. Not just the map, not just the evidence, the choice, she thought. Edmund made a decision about Callum with full information. I can make my own decision now with full information too. That is what he gave me, not the answer, the ability to choose. Meanwhile, she later learned, Callum was not sitting still. He met with Marcus Webb alone, without any agenda other than to listen. Webb told him things he had needed to hear and had not had anyone to hear from for a long time, about what Edmund Voss had actually trusted him with, about the difference between being given someone's work and being given someone's daughter. Then Callum went back to his office and did something he had not done in 11 years of building the most comprehensive information network in Chicago. He opened a new file. He typed the name, Nora Voss. He looked at the blank white page for a long time. Then he closed the file. Did not delete it. Did not fill it in. Just closed it. For the first time in 11 years. He chose not to know in advance. In the meantime, Mast moved. He used political leverage to request that the Hargrove Institute hand over materials related to an ongoing federal investigation a formal, legal, above-board action that would have allowed him to identify and destroy what Edmund had built before it ever reached the people it needed to reach. Callum blocked it. Not with threats. Not with anything that would leave a mark. He released preliminary documentation of Mast's connection to the archive break-in to 3 independent journalists at the same time. On background, with enough specificity that each journalist could individually verify the core claim, Mast did not receive a threat. He received a message. The information already exists outside your control. And if you push further, more of it enters circulation. Mast backed off. But the central problem remained. The 7 pieces of evidence still needed to be gathered and placed somewhere they could never be destroyed, never be buried, never be silenced by any amount of political pressure or legal maneuvering. And the only person who could navigate the complete map was the one who had not answered his messages in 3 days. He could find her. He was Callum Reyes. He could find anyone in Chicago before breakfast. But finding her and having earned the right to ask her to come back were 2 completely different things. He understood the difference. He had not always, he thought. He was beginning to now. He waited. She came back on the 7th day. She arrived at the building at 8:47 in the morning without calling ahead. Phil was at the front desk. He saw her come through the door and he stood up from his chair, which he did not usually do, and he nodded at her in a way that was different from how he usually nodded at people. More direct, as if he had been thinking about something and was relieved to see her. He said, "Good morning." "Miss Voss," she said. "Good morning." "Phil, is he here?" Phil said, "He has been here since 7. She rode up to the 14th floor. The outer office was empty. She went directly to the main room. Callum was at his table, reading. When she came in, he set the book down differently than he usually set things down, more slowly, with more attention, as if the setting down itself mattered. She stood in the doorway. She said, "2 new conditions." He said, "Tell me." She said, "1. If you receive any information that affects my safety or Jake's safety, you tell me immediately. Not after you have assessed whether it is strategically useful for me to know. Immediately." He said, "Agreed." He said, 2. When this is finished, when it is completely finished, I want to know everything. Not a summary. Not what you decide I should know. Everything. I will make my own decisions about what to do with it." He said, "That is a significant ask." He said, "I know. It is what I need." He looked at her. Then he said, "Agreed." She walked into the room. She said, "I am not telling you that I have forgiven you." He said, "I am not asking you to." She said, "I am telling you that I understand why you made the choice you made. I understand the calculation and the fear behind it. And I think you were wrong. And I think you know you were wrong." He said, "Yes." She said, "That is enough to continue." She hung her coat on the back of the chair she always used, sat down, said, "Show me where we are." They worked differently that morning. Not better or worse differently. There was a small conscious distance between them that had not been there before, and both of them maintained it with a kind of deliberate respect for what it represented. At the same time, there was something else, a straightforwardness that comes from having nothing left to pretend. At some point, he asked for her opinion on an approach to a problem that was entirely outside the scope of the map. She knew immediately that he did not need her opinion. He had more relevant experience than she had on this specific question. But he asked genuinely, and listened when she answered, and adjusted his thinking based on what she said. She noticed a book on his desk that had not been there before. A history of cartographic methodology in Chicago during the interwar period. The period her father had documented most extensively. She said nothing about it, but something in her chest shifted, like a door she had been holding closed from the inside, deciding to stay closed on its own. Ryan contacted Callum later that day. He did not contact Nora. He reached out to his brother directly. He asked for a meeting. Callum told her before he went. He said, "Ryan wants to see me. He is not asking for anything specific. I think he is trying to find out which way to move." She said, "If he wants to help, give him the chance. If he does not want to help, that is still information." She did not go to the meeting. This was a conversation between brothers, and she did not belong in it. Callum met Ryan at a neutrals location, a coffee shop in the West Loop that Ryan had chosen, which Callum noted meant Ryan was not yet willing to come to Callum's territory. Ryan looked like a person who had not been sleeping in his own bed, expensive suit worn imprecisely, eyes that had been calculating something for too long without finding the answer. Ryan said, "I did not know they were going to kill him." Callum said, "But you knew who they were." Ryan said, "I thought I was providing consulting services, financial analysis, nothing criminal." Callum said, "Ryan, just the name, nothing else." Ryan was quiet and said, "You knew enough to leave Nora 3 days after Edmund died. You knew enough to not be anywhere near her or the situation. You protected yourself." Ryan said nothing. Callum said, "I am not here for an apology. I am here because you are still my brother, and because I need to know which side of this you are going to be on when it matters." A long silence. Then Ryan said, "What do I need to do?" The answer to that question, it turned out, was to provide a detailed account of every interaction he had had with Mast's team who had approached him, what they had asked for, what he had provided, and what he had understood versus what she had chosen not to examine too closely. It was not comfortable, but it was complete. And that completeness, that willingness to sit to the discomfort of telling the full truth, was the first genuinely brave thing Ryan Reyes had done in a long time. That same afternoon, Nora and Callum went to the first evidence location, a building in Bridgeport that had been used as a logistics centre in the 1990s and was now a mixed-use development. Her father had hidden materials inside a section of the original structural framework, inside a sealed cavity that the renovation had left intact. They went in cleanly, retrieved the package, and were on their way out when one of Mast's people materialized from a doorway 2 floors down. Callum started moving them toward the back exit he had scouted, but Nora saw something he had not: a secondary stairwell, partially hidden behind a temporary construction barrier that had been put up that morning, recent enough that it would not be on any map Callum had pulled. She said, "There. Left corridor, secondary stairs. Street level on the south side." He looked each direction. They went through without stopping. On the street, walking quickly toward the car, Callum said, "You were right," she said. "I know," he said. "About the exit," she said. "I know." "A block further," he said. "You would have been a very good cartographer." She did not answer right away. She walked beside him in the grey afternoon light and thought about what he was actually saying, not a compliment about her professional skills, but a recognition that she had inherited something real from her father, something that lived not in any encoded map, but in the way she moved through space and noticed things and trusted what she noticed. She said, "I think I already am one." He looked at her. One corner of his mouth lifted slightly, not a smirk, something warmer. That evening they sat in the office without the map on the table between them. The first time since this had all begun that there was no map present. My father left a handwritten note, not encoded, not in any system, just a piece of paper in an envelope tucked inside the cover of his copy of a survey methodology text from 1962. "I found it last week," he said. "What did it say?" She said. He said that the most important thing he had ever mapped was the people worth protecting, and he listed 3 names. He paused. She said, "Jake, and me, and Callum Reyes." The room was quiet. He said, "He listed my name." She said, "He listed your name." He looked down at his hands. The letter had been written long before the mistake he had made, before the threat report, before the decision not to warn. Edmund had written Callum's name into that list before any of the recent events, which meant he had been watching Callum for long enough to believe, with whatever complicated and honest faith he had in complicated and honest people, that Callum Reyes was worth protecting. He said, "He was not saying you are perfect. He was saying you are worth it. Those are not the same thing." He said, "No, they are not," she said. "But I think he was right about both." The window showed the city below, lights coming on in the early dark of November, the lake invisible in the distance, but present in the particular dryness of the air. she said. We have 6 more locations. Let us plan the sequence for the next 4 days, he said. Yes. She picked up her notebook. He picked up his. They got back to work. They worked through the final 6 locations over 4 days. Chicago, 1 in a suburb to the north, 1 in Milwaukee, 1 outside the city in a township that barely registered on modern maps, and the last one in Boston. Jake retrieved the Boston materials himself. Nora had called him the night before and told him where to go and what to look for and why it mattered. Jake had listened without interrupting, which was not something he did naturally. When she was finished, he said, Dad really trusted you with all of this. He said, yes, he said. He was right to. He found the materials the next morning, a sealed package in the archive of a small historical library near his campus, deposited under a catalogue number that matched a notation in Edmund's journal. Jake photographed the contents and sent them to Nora within the hour. When everything was assembled, all 7 pieces, 20 years of careful documentation, cross-referenced and complete, the picture that emerged was larger and older than even she had fully grasped from the map alone. Her father had not easily documented Senator Mast's corrupt connections. He had documented 20 years of the intersection between political power and organized crime in Chicago, the people who funded campaigns and the people who moved money, the decisions that were made in rooms that did not appear on any official record, the way a city actually runs. As opposed to the story it tells about itself, it was not designed to explode. It was designed to last. He was not building a weapon. Callum said. No, she said. He was building a library. A real one. The kind that waits, he said. Yes, he said. And he knew that the right place to keep it, he said, was always the Hargrove Institute. Always with you. She thought about her father cataloguing every piece, every location, every encoded detail, across 20 years, knowing the whole time that if something went wrong, the path would lead to his daughter, that she would find it, that she would be able to read it. He had taught her the coordinates game at age 9 and never once let her suspect it was anything more than a game. Callum met with Senator Mast 2 days later, not at Mast's office, not on any ground the senator controlled. A restaurant in the Loop, empty at that hour, with a table near the window so that anyone passing on the sidewalk could see 2 men having a quiet conversation over coffee. Callum placed a document on the table between them, a 12-page summary, specific, sourced, precise, he said. This is what Edmund Voss documented about you and the network connected to you across 18 years. It is going into a historical archive at the Hargrove Institute. It will be sealed for 25 years. At that point, either the situation will have changed enough that it no longer has practical consequence, or it will matter enough that it deserves to be found. Mast looked at the document without touching it. And if I choose to, Callum said, if you move against anyone connected to this Nora Voss, her brother, anyone in my network, anyone at Hargrove, the full record goes out, not to 1 journalist, to 7, with documentation complete enough to survive any legal challenge. Mast said, you would expose yourself doing that. Callum said, Edmund Voss spent 20 years building something designed to protect people. I am in the business of honouring that. What I expose about myself matters considerably less than what I protect. Mast looked at him across the table. Callum met the look and held it without moving. The senator picked up his coffee cup, set it back down, and stood up. He straightened his jacket. He said, Good afternoon, Mr. Reyes. He left. Callum sat at the table for a few minutes after he was gone. He looked out the window at the Loop Street traffic and the ordinary people walking home from ordinary jobs. He thought about Edmund Voss. About 15 years of quarterly maps arriving with the same careful precision. About a man who had understood what Callum was building and had believed, with that particular and honest faith of his, that the direction Callum was moving was worth documenting. He had not felt certain of that for a long time. He was beginning to feel certain of it again. That night, Nora was working late in the archive when he arrived. She heard the elevator and knew the footstep rhythm by now. He came in with coffee the right kind, which no longer surprised her. he said. It is done. Mast will not move again. The materials are secure, he said. You are sure? He said. He understood the situation clearly. Yes, she said. What did you say to him? He told her, including the last part, the part about what mattered less and what mattered more. She listened. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. She said, You meant that, he said. Yes, he said. That is different from the version of you that withheld the threat report. Yes, it is. She got up and went to the shelving on the south wall. She came back with a small wooden box, the kind archivists use for fragile documents. She set it on the table in front of him. He said, My father left one more thing. Not in the map, not in the envelope. In the archive itself, catalogued under my employee number, with a flag attached that said, For Miss Voss to retrieve after March 14th. He looked at the box. She said, It is his journals. 20 years of them. Everything he thought that did not fit into the encoded maps. The way a person thinks. Not just the way a person documents. She pushed the box toward him. She said, He catalogued them for you. Not for me. Your name is on the access designation. Not mine, he said. He knew I would be here. He mapped everything worth keeping. He put both hands on the table on either side of the box and looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at her. She said, What do you want, Callum, after this? What comes next for you? He said. You mean after tonight? He said. After tonight. After all of it. He thought about it. Genuinely thought. The way he did when something mattered enough to give it his full attention. He said, I want to stop knowing everything about everyone before they know I know. I want to stop being 3 steps ahead of every conversation before it starts. I want to find out what comes next by actually waiting to see what comes next, she said. That sounds frightening, he said, genuinely terrifying. She looked at him. There was something in his face she had not seen there before. Or maybe she had seen it and not known what she was looking at. The particular expression of a person who has been armored for a long time and is, carefully and with full awareness of what it costs, beginning to take the armor off, she said. There is a research consultation position at the Institute, someone who reads patterns in historical records and connects them to current events. It pays poorly, he said. I do not need the salary, she said. I know. I am not offering you the salary. He said, What are you offering? She said. A reason to show up somewhere every day. A place where someone will notice if you are not there. He stood up. He moved around the table to where she was standing, slowly. The way you move toward something fragile, not because it is weak, but because you do not want to be the reason it breaks. He put his hand against her face, carefully. The way her father had once held old maps, like something that deserved to be handled with precision. She did not move back. He said, I will show up. She looked up at him. The archive was quiet around them. 34 zero documents holding their collective breath in the stacks. He said, I know you will. Outside, Chicago was doing what Chicago does in winter, pressing the cold against every window, filling the streets with the particular grey-blue light of a city that has survived too many hard seasons to be surprised by one more. Her father had loved this city, had spent 20 years mapping it in ways that nobody else could see, finding the truth of it underneath the story it told about itself. She had inherited his hands, his habit of noticing, his way of believing that the right things, kept carefully enough, would outlast the wrong ones. She was beginning to think he had been right about more than the maps. 6 months later, the Hargrove Institute archive, on a Tuesday afternoon in May, when the light through the narrow basement windows had finally turned from grey to something warmer. There were 2 desks in Nora's workroom now. The second one had appeared on a Monday morning 5 months ago, carried up from storage by Phil and set in the corner near the window. It had a notebook on it, and a pen, and a cup of good coffee from the place on the corner, and nothing else. No laptop, no phone. Callum was not an employee of the Hargrove Institute. That would have been a story too neat for real life, and both of them knew it. But he came 3 afternoons a week, and on those afternoons they worked on the project that had grown out of what her father had started, a complete historical record of Chicago's power structures across the decades. how the city had changed and who had shaped those changes and what that meant for the people who had lived through them. Not an archive of damage, a record of what mattered. The materials from her father's 7 locations were now properly catalogued and stored at Hargrove, sealed under a 25-year restricted access designation per the agreement that had kept Mast from doing anything further. Webb had consulted on the legal structure. A law professor at the University of Chicago had reviewed the documentation. Edmund Voss's work would wait 25 years to be fully seen, but it would wait. Ryan was cooperating with a federal investigation into the broader network that Mast had operated through. He was not testifying against anyone. In exchange for immunity, he was simply telling what he knew, fully and completely, without the protective colouring of strategic omission. This was, Callum had noted without editorializing, the first time in his adult life that Ryan had done something the hard way instead of the easy one. It was not redemption. It was a first step by a person who had remembered, just barely in time, that first steps exist. Jake had come to Chicago twice in the past 6 months. The first time he had brought Claire, and they had eaten at the Italian place on Taylor Street that their father had loved. And nobody had cried at the table, but everybody had understood what the meal was for. The second time he had come alone, to help Nora begin the process of going through what remained of Edmund's apartment, the things the searchers had not taken, the things that were personal rather than professional. On that second visit, Jake had met Callum for the first time. He had looked at Callum for about 5 seconds. Then he had looked at Nora. Then back at Callum. Later he had pulled her into the hallway and said, quietly, he is kind of terrifying. She had said, he is kind of everything. Jake had said, Dad would have liked him. She had not answered. But she had not argued. Phil retired at the end of March. There was a small party in the staff room with grocery store cake and the good coffee from the corner place. When it was over and everyone had drifted out, Phil had come and found Nora at her desk, and he had shaken her hand. He had said, Your father was a good man. Miss Voss, so was the other one. I think, when he stopped pretending he was not. She had thought about that for a long time after. On the Tuesday afternoon in May, Callum was reading at his desk and making careful notes in his notebook questions. As always, to be crossed off as they were answered. She was processing a new collection that had come in from a property on the north side. Old photographs. Letters from the 1930s. A child's drawing of a house that no longer existed. The ordinary things. She worked steadily, and every so often she looked up and saw him at the corner desk, and the particular light of the May afternoon was face, and he was frowning slightly at something he was reading in the way he frowned when something interesting resisted easy understanding. She looked for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she went back to work. At 6, she shut down her computer and began her closing round lights off in the reading room. Document storage checked. Exterior door latched. The routine she had done for 5 years. The routine she would probably do for another 30. She was a cartographer's daughter in an archive, which meant she was in exactly the right place when she came back. He was standing at the door with his coat and the bag he carried. Waiting, she said. Ready, he said, yes. They went out together through the front door. Phil's replacement, a young man named Kevin, who was still learning the geography of the building, had the door already open, because he had learned within his first week that these two left at 6, and he had started opening the door at 5:58. Some habits pass from person to person without anyone deciding to pass them on. Outside, the May evening was mild, and the streets were full of people who had been waiting all winter for an evening exactly like this one. The lake was visible to the east. Catching the last of the light, they walked. They did not talk immediately. They had long since passed the point where silence between them needed to be managed. Silence was just silence, the comfortable kind. The kind that means something has been settled. After a block, he said, I finished the 1940s section today. The documentation on the ward boundaries is more complicated than I expected. The ward boundaries were always political. Even the geographic ones, he said. Yes, I understand that now, she said. My father spent 3 years on that section. He told me once it was the most interesting thing he ever worked on because it was where the city's story about itself was most different from the city's actual history. He said, "That is still true." She said, "Yes. It will probably always be true about Chicago." They walked another half block. She said, "Jake called this morning. He is thinking about applying to doctoral programs, history, possibly urban history." Callum said, "Edmund would have found that very satisfying." She said, "I think he would have." The light changed. They crossed the street, with the crowd of ordinary people going home from ordinary days in this old and complicated city. Her father had mapped it 20 different ways and had understood that the map is never the territory is always larger, always more itself, always exceeding what any single document can hold. The document is just the attempt, the honest, careful, necessary attempt to say, "I was here. I paid attention. This is what I found." That was what she did every day in the archive. What Edmund did in his own way for 20 years. What Callum was learning, slowly and not without difficulty, to do alongside her. She was her father's daughter. She always had been. She understood that now without grief or with grief and alongside it, which was the only honest relationship to have with it. Edmund Voss had given her a language and a habit of mind and finally, in the last act of his careful life, a reason to use both. She had used them. She was still using them. The city moved around her, the lake and the grid of streets and the specific grey beauty of a place that knows exactly what it is, and Callum walked beside her in the evening light. Not because circumstances required it, because he had said he would show up, and he was the kind of person, she had learned, who meant what he said when he said the things that mattered, he thought. This is what it looks like. Not the fairy tale version. Not the version where everything resolves cleanly and the archive is full of only good things and the past does not leave marks. The real version, where two people who have both been alone for a long time walk down a city street in May, carrying between them the weight of what they have been through, and find that the weight is manageable because it is shared. That was the thing her father had been trying to tell her. Not just in the margin note, not just in the map, in all of it, in the 20 years of choosing to do this work, in the bedtime stories with hidden coordinates, in the quarterly updates that arrived without fail. He had been saying, "The world is real. Look at it directly, and find the people who will stand beside you while you do." She had found them. The archive held 34 documents now, and more arriving every month. It held her father's work. It held, in a sealed box with restricted access for 25 years, the most careful documentation one man had ever made of the thing a city tries to hide from itself. And it held, in no catalogue and no finding aid, the particular quality of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, when the light was right and the work was good, and the person at the desk in the corner looked up at exactly the moment she did. That too was worth keeping. That too was the cartographer's daughter's work. This book is a work of imagination. Names, characters, places, and incidents either are products of the author's creativity or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to real persons or actual events is unintentional and should not be construed as factual representation.
Before you walk away from this story, I want you to sit with something for just a moment. This was never really about a map. It was never really about a senator, or an archive, or a dark hotel room where a woman reached for the wrong man in the dark. This story was about a father who loved his daughter in the only language he knew, by paying attention, by documenting, by believing for 20 years that the truth carefully kept is more powerful than any weapon ever made. Edmund Voss could not be there when it mattered most. But he had spent a lifetime making sure his daughter would not need him to be. That is the first lesson. The people who love us best are not always the ones who tell us the most. Sometimes they are the ones who quietly build something, a skill, a habit, a way of seeing the world, and plant it in us so early that we never even notice we were being prepared. The second lesson belongs to Callum. Smart people make a specific kind of mistake. They use what they know to manage outcomes instead of trusting people with the truth. They call it protection. It is not protection. It is control. And it always costs more than they expect. The third lesson is Nora's. Coming back after being hurt is not weakness. It is the hardest kind of strength there is. Forgiveness is not the point. Understanding is, and understanding, when it is honest, opens doors that anger permanently closes. And Ryan is the lesson we least want to admit applies to us. Every betrayal starts the same way, not with a decision to do evil, with a decision to do what is easier. One small choice, then another, until the person you were is somewhere so far behind you that you cannot see them anymore. This story is not about crime. It is about what it costs to carry the truth alone. What it means to trust someone with the most important thing you have ever built. And what happens finally, after all the careful years, when the right people find each other at exactly the right moment. Your father left you something too. Maybe not a map. Maybe not coordinates hidden in bedtime stories. But something. Think about what it was. And think about whether you have read it yet.